waited long enough. Thank you all for coming. I know that it may be a bit of a weird time in Australia, a bit too early, but it's only for this week. And today we are very happy that Heide has agreed to jump in for Steven and give us, for Stefan, and give us a talk about applied immersive games that they do at the University of Canterbury. So thank you again, and I'm handing over to you.
Thank you, Alexander, for the introduction. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here. As Alexander said, I jumped in for Stefan, and you may have recognized that we carry the same surname. We committed double brain drain from Europe 2 years ago, and now I'm an associate professor at the HIT Lab NZ at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch. My background and what I'm doing here is especially in the field of applied immersive games. And I will tell a little bit about how I define or understand this term, and what I did in my previous work and what I'm doing here at the HIT Lab. I try to make it a little bit interactive, so whenever you have a question or a comment, just raise your actual or virtual hand or shout at me or just pose your question. I'm really happy to make this a discussion too. So first of all, to make it interactive, is there anyone who can tell me where this picture is taken?
Looks like Amsterdam.
Just roughly. Pardon?
I have guessed Amsterdam.
It's very close. So this is Delft, yes, and that is in Holland. So it's also called Little Amsterdam. It's a little bit south to Amsterdam, and it has also these beautiful canals and medieval city center. And this is where I lived and worked for 11 years before coming to the HIT Lab and before moving to Christchurch. And I worked there at the Delft University of Technology. I was head of their game lab there, and I was working there at a faculty that teaches engineering students the science of management and policy making. And now I moved to Christchurch, where I work in the HIT Lab. I'm also an associated editor of the Simulation and Gaming Journal. And for me, the small pictures always disappear from the slide. Is it just my computer, or do you have the same? Can you see all the pictures?
Okay. Yes, now we see them all.
Good. So I'm a social scientist and media scientist myself. So I'm not a technology expert, while I understand, of course, their approach and understand some elements of computer science and development. I apply design science principles, so I'm usually also involved in the design process of the instruments that I use in my research, which are games. And I'm also in the field of applied sciences. So whatever I do, I really apply it to students or experts. And you see a lot of pictures from games where I have been involved in the design and application process. And that really spans from games without a lot of material that I developed for the Red Cross Climate Center, for example, on resilience and climate change. They have an excellent website if you're exploring this field, but also up to AR and VR games. And as I said, I will tell you a little bit about my work. I can tell you a little bit about results from the work that I did in Delft. As I'm here only for 2 years now at the HIT Lab NZ, I have more questions related to my current work than I do have answers. But maybe some of them will be able to also trigger some of your thinking and questions. It's also what I do in my teaching. So I also teach applied game design here in the HIT Lab, and I did it in Delft. In Delft, it was mainly about trying to use gaming techniques and game development processes to understand so-called complex socio-technical systems. And games are really a very powerful and useful method for that, because they are complex systems in itself. And we can use them to simplify complex processes and complex systems and help people from students to experts and decision makers to really engage with the system, to get feedback and to try out like future scenarios and future decisions in a very safe environment, in a very safe space. And students do this to also understand like the systems, but of course also to try out the technology. And here in the HIT Lab, we are really an interdisciplinary group. So we approach it from like the field of psychology, from the educational field, but of course also to find out like how to design and how to use the technology so that the user really can make use of it and develop valuable and insightful outcomes. However, like in the public, games are very often seen as this. Namely like children who spend too much time in front of screens. So we often see also, or including in the academic literature, that they are described as an addictive and senseless activity, that they only leave like very little and too little time for other and more important aspects of life, that they don't include physical activity, so that they trigger unhealthy habit and behavior, leading to loneliness and aggressive behavior. And that is very often, especially like in the newspapers, because people don't understand the motivation for game design and the use of games, the act of play, and the power that games carry. So these are like more the bad connotations. And as I said, you also find them in scientific literature, so not only in the Rainbow Press. However, I do have a little bit of trouble here. So I don't know who of you knows this funny guy? Anyone? This is Antanas Mokos, and Antanas Mokos was the mayor of Bogota. And the citizens of Bogota are said to be kind of stubborn people, and they don't like following rules, including traffic and parking rules. That led to like a lot of dangerous situations across the city. And Antanas, he didn't like that situation in his city very much when he was a mayor there. So sometimes he jumped in this very silly spandex suit, which is the suit of the super citizen. And then he engaged in a very playful way, but like for a serious purpose with his citizens. And he rewarded good behavior with these little cards that you see next to the picture of Antanas Mokos. So like you did a good job in like driving to the speed limit and parking your car in the proper way, you get a thumbs up and you get a thumbs down if that's not the case. And you can look him up on Wikipedia or on the internet, and you see that like the traffic behavior and the sense of community in the city of Bogota really increased to the better while he was mayor there and did a lot of these kind of things. He also received a lot of threats, and again he like addressed these threats with kind of playful behavior, wearing like a protective vest, but like where his heart is still cut out. So this is just to raise awareness and to address like our playful culture that you can see in all human beings. When you observe like how children learn, for example, it's in a playful behavior, it's by learning and doing and exploring things. And as adults, we like unlearn this behavior a little bit because of social norms and expectations. But still, it's a very powerful way to like learn and engage. And when we talk about immersive games, we talk about like not so much playfulness in itself, but games as like predefined and developed artifacts. And when we talk about like, or with the students here, it's always like, is it now technology or is it art? I would say it's both. So this is now what I mean with the audio. So you don't have to listen to these people. They are also talking in Dutch. But this is a video that shows you where we developed a game. So not so much playful behavior, but to trigger playful behavior. And it's a digital game that you see here. Transport managers are playing in teams of 2. And we based this game on realistic models of traffic behavior in the transportation system. We simplified it in a way so that they can engage with it. We represent some resources from this system. The game has certain rules, and players engage with the games by play. So this is like the basics of how you could describe applied games, which are games that are not only made for entertainment purposes, but for purposes beyond this. So it's games where really like people should learn something from, but it's also for really professionals. As I said, in that sense, it's transportation managers who can like gather deeper insights or try out decisions, for example, without like having serious consequences. So in that way, that way they can make sense of the world around them in a playful and interactive way, and the games offer a certain type of meaning to them. Application areas for these games, because you can imagine, especially when we talk about digital games, developing such games is relatively expensive in time and costs. So you have to think carefully about like possible application areas. In all systems and situations that are otherwise difficult or dangerous to engage with are possible application cases. So this is This is an example of a PhD student's work, again from, it doesn't play here, does it play with you? Oh yeah. From a PhD student at the Delft University of Technology, where she developed a digital game that simulates a tsunami on that island that you see. And as a player, you play a participant in a concert on that island. And then there's a news item saying that a tsunami happens. And this game was not made for like educating people or raising their awareness, but it's made as a research instrument. Because of course it would be way too dangerous and maybe even impossible to put people in a real tsunami situation. But what we can do is simulating this and then researching what kind of behavior and what kind of decisions they would make. So in this game or environment, there are two major evacuation routes, for example. One is shorter, but it takes you across a bridge, which could, of course, also be affected by the tsunami. And the other one is a little bit longer, but it doesn't include the bridge. And then this PhD student used this system to really explore the behavior of players. And I show you this because like a lot of people have a certain understanding or image when talking about like applied games or serious games, that they are used for training and learning, but not so much that we can also use them as a research tool. Here at the HIT Lab, we are of course also very much interested in the design process. So not only in the effects of these games, but also how to design, how do they have to look like to offer an interactive, engaging and meaningful experience. There are some insights in how to approach this is to analyze a complex real-life situation with all its elements and stakeholders, and to translate this into meaningful game elements, which always means that we'll have to simplify reality so that we have to reduce the elements and the relationships. And that's a very hard part where we often make use of like scientific concepts, but it's also a very creative process. And it's difficult because you really have to make decisions on what kind of elements are meaningful and important for like the learning process or the decision-making process, and which elements do you have to let go. And then a huge part in applying these games in situations like research or decision-making is the so-called debriefing. So it's not only that players learn or create awareness by playing the game, which is an important part of it, but triggering self-reflection, triggering learning, and also making people understand and think about how they can transfer what they have learned in the game to the real world, because this is what we want to do, right? We want to make an impact with these games. So how they can translate these things in experiences and commit to real actions. This is like called, or often caught in the debriefing phase. There are a lot of models in literature that describe this process as like a very linear sequence, where like players play the game first and coming into a session without a lot of knowledge, and then they play the game and then they enter a debriefing phase. And in my work, we are looking into like new models where we have a more iterative process. So where like we somehow include reflection phases during gameplay without like breaking the flow and the experience of playing a game. And that because we really think that this would be really valuable for the players and for us as researchers to just think about new models of how to combine gameplay and debriefing and learning. Then, of course, we talk about immersion. So I said like the initiative that I'm leading here at the HIT Lab is called the Applied Immersive Games Gaming Initiative. So of course, like we create immersion by using immersive technologies like augmented reality and virtual reality. So you can see like my children here enjoying what we are doing at work, which is some work that Stefan also was involved in the superhuman sports competition, where they climbed through a virtual mountain area. And you can see like in the video in the middle, like how realistic and immersive this really is, and how present my son feels in the mountain environment, and how scary it is to be on this little plank. Here in the HIT Lab, which you see in the other picture, is that they are playing an augmented reality game. Yeah, it's like we don't try it out in the lab anymore unless we have like space enough, because people become so immersed that they forget that they are in an actual physical environment, and we don't want to hurt anyone, of course. But we can also produce immersion by storytelling. So you don't necessarily need like technology and a lot of expensive and time intensive developments. This is a picture of a game that we made for the Department of Traffic Management of the city of The Hague, which is the capital of the Netherlands. And it is confronted with the challenge that it has a growing population, but it doesn't have space to expand, because The Hague is a coastal city and it's like surrounded by other municipalities. But of course, they want to make their city future-proof, also including like new ways and future ways of mobility with like self-driving vehicles and all that stuff. So what we actually did was for this department to just try out how they could change or update the existing infrastructure. We developed a very simplified map of the city, and then we developed some scenarios and some tasks for them to play through. And you can see like all these colorful tokens on the board. They represent certain routes through the city. And in a second round, they were able to use tiles to actually update the infrastructure with roundabouts or with cycle lanes. And with this, they could like see the effect of their changes on the actual infrastructure. And it was like, it showed that this was a very immersive experience for them, because even in this simplified version of their city, there were some like landmarks that all of them immediately recognized. And also they immediately recognized like vital or like the most promising solutions maybe. And we did this in a really playful way. So we had like a day-long workshop with 4 different groups, and they had to compete with each other. So there were some values and then like some point system related to that. And that really made them like become really immerse and really engage, because like, of course, we are all humans. So most of us want to compete and most of us want to win. And that really like triggered their thinking and really like motivated them to really think about really good solutions. So in my work, I understand immersion not only as like a technological characteristic, but immersion can also be produced by storytelling or by realistic tasks and engaging tasks. What we also do here is creating games that hurt vulnerable people. This is now like a switch from what I did in the Netherlands to what I do here. It is that I'm working with 2 PhD students on finding out ways how we can support children with ADHD. So these are children who really have difficulties to pay attention for a longer time, that don't have a very good working memory. So like they forget what the teacher just said 3 minutes ago. And like a lot of cognitive problems come with it. And VR seems to be a promising approach. So there's a little bit of literature and studies about it. And there's this game that I can show you here. This is not from the HIT lab and for me, it's an American study. And it's the first really approved game against ADHD in the US. When we saw it here in the lab, we couldn't believe our eyes, I have to say, because our PhD student here, what she did, and these are the first results, she really looked into the psychological literature on what are ADHD characteristics, and that's the purple tables that you see, and the definitions and the symptoms that these children show. And then she looked into game literature and the literature on virtual reality, how we could address, so what kind of elements we could choose to create an environment that can help these children. And all the first results that we identified were not what you just saw. So what you just saw was like a video game with like a lot of elements and moving parts and music. And it seems that like this group of children would need a much more simpler and calmer environment. So Maike, which is the PhD student working on this project, she really looked also into like color theory and all that stuff to create an immersive game where you can see a screenshot here, which works with like very calm colors. There's not too much going on. They can access like help and support instructions if they want, because they forget instructions very easily. And a lot of the children struggling with ADHD also seem to struggle with math tasks. So she created a game with the math tasks. And the aim of her study is to really explore how such a VR game should look like to help children in formal education with a VR game. And hopefully she will be able to test this out with 2 schools here in Christchurch and in Nelson very soon. And then see like how the children also experience it, which is a little bit tricky because like finding children with ADHD is really hard. And like children without this cognitive impairment may find this really boring. So that's really like one of the challenges in this research at the moment, how to test what we've developed and how to get like validated feedback. Another PhD student is looking into the design of immersive games for young adults with social anxiety, which is an issue, like I think it's a societal issue, but it's definitely a challenge here in Christchurch, where a lot of young people went through like different disasters and traumatic experiences through the last years, since the earthquakes, then there was a fire, there was the mosque shooting, and now COVID. So you can imagine that a lot of young people do feel a lot of anxiety and depression. And there are some good approaches already in the digital field. So you can find a lot of applications that also make use of some psychological therapy approaches. The most prominent is cognitive behavior therapy, because it's really hard for a lot of these people to get like real and professional help by a human being, because the system is so overloaded. So what we are going to do is to look into how can we like not make an alternative for real therapy, but how can we create an addition to, for example, bridge the waiting time that somebody has, or to raise more awareness that it's completely normal to feel anxious from time to time and how to deal with it. Because it's also something that in New Zealand society, especially males struggle with it, but they also tend to not speak about it and not to seek help. So this is something where we team up with the psychology department here to really find out ways how to design an immersive game for this target group. And as I said, I can't like present a lot of research results because these are all really young studies, but questions that we are working on. So as I said, how to co-design effective games that support the target group. And Maike, for example, she found some questionnaires that are really like focused on children, because children, I hope they will be honest with us, but it's really hard and we can't like use the complex and complicated scientific questionnaires because they will just like not understand us. But there are questionnaires in games user research that are particularly made for this user group. But of course, we talk about vulnerable groups and we talk about research in COVID times. And usually we would like create some face-to-face workshops to co-design our games with the groups. And we have to find ways now how to co-create our games so that they are meaningful and interactive and accepted by the users without maybe being able to go to the schools or engage with community groups, and what methods to use for the feedback. So again, like this is not an answer, but these are questions that we are working on at the moment. Then a jump back to the Netherlands, because this is work that I'm really interested in, what I just showed you. And whenever I have to prepare a presentation, I always try to like find an umbrella term for what I'm doing, because I'm really like a person who knows about game design and evaluation of games and how to understand people's problems and turn them into a game concept. I'm not a domain person, so I'm not like a transportation or a sports expert. So I can apply my method to a lot of fields. And I think the umbrella term that I found for myself is in the title of the presentation, to like help people and societies become more resilient. So this of course also brings me to the field of like crisis management and first responders. So in the Netherlands, I worked a lot with the Dutch police and with the firefighters, because like there were two organizations who were really interested in exploring the new technologies like games, virtual reality and augmented reality, and how they could utilize it in their work. So one game that we made for the Dutch police is called Charlie Papa. And this is the game that we made for and with the police. For communication training in teams. And this is these are some special forces that we work with that protect like politicians and members of the royal family in the Netherlands. And they wanted a highly realistic environment because they said it's only useful for us when we can recognize our work environment. And this is a game that is like, I would say 8 years old somehow. So technology wasn't that advanced like now, but if you knew like the inner city of The Hague, where the parliament is placed, you would immediately recognize this in this game. And this is like where these protection teams usually work. And then there's like some simple interface that we built in where they can communicate with each other. So the way that these teams work is that they usually like enter an environment, and then they have to make like, or they observe what happens in the environment, they communicate it to their team members, and any point of time they like decide whether an environment is safe or not, and whether a politician or like the king can cross this plane or not. And they wanted to have something that like simulates this process and that they can use for training. And one of the good things about games is that you can create a realistic environment, but you can introduce surprising and unrealistic elements to train on. So in one of the scenarios that we built, we put a sniper on one of the roofs of these buildings that you just saw. And one of the first feedbacks from a police agent trying out this game was that this was super unrealistic and invaluable for them for their training efforts, because there are no snipers in The Hague. But after they played it and implemented in the organization, we got a lot of positive feedback, because they said it really changed the way we look at the environment. We tend to like look at like a bit unusual behavior, or we looked in dustbins for like whatever obvious objects, but we didn't like look onto like the buildings, because we didn't anticipate some threat from there. So it really changed their behavior. And in the research that we did with this game, we learned like not to create too complicated questionnaires, because we had questionnaires that like try to combine a lot of existing ones, and it was just way too long and way too complicated for these practitioners. So I'm not sure how like really well the data are. That's something that was like a tough learning for us. We also learned that like for the communication skill, the whole build of this realistic environment wouldn't have been needed. So I think we could have gone away with like a much more simplified environment to train communication skills to them. But to like apply something in an organization that is used to realistic training scenarios, and to also build up situation awareness and build up this perspective taking, the development of this realistic environment was necessary. So it provided us with a better understanding of like there are of course different learning goals, and then you need like different elements in a game and in an environment to address those. I'm very sorry for the background noise that's somewhere in front of my window. We did another experiment, not with virtual reality games, but with AR technology, also with police agents and firefighters. And that was to explore augmented reality for remote collaboration. I don't know if like some of you know this from Stefan's presentations, because this is something that I did together with him. This was really to see what kind of AR elements, what types of information would be most useful for remote teams. In that sense, we had like agents on police agents on a scene, and we had like remote experts in a different room. And we created this, what we call a box game, for example, where like the police agent has to explore the environment, these boxes, and the remote expert has the information about what's in the boxes. And then the remote expert can give like orders to the police agent at the scene, whether it's safe to open the box or whether there's an explosive in the box. And that went well, and it was much more technology like focused project that we really wanted to see what kind of information and visualization is really helpful. What we learned here again is to also include the ethical aspects of such an experiment, because we had like one remote expert and she didn't pay attention for like, I don't know, 1-2 minutes, and then was asked by one of the police agents, is it safe to open the box? And she said, yeah, just go ahead. And they did it, but they found an explosive. And our feedback was then, the experiment is over because you are dead, you found an explosive. The remote expert was so shocked that she indeed stopped the experiment, and that she didn't want to go on anymore, because she said like, this really questions my role here now, because like I feel very responsible, and I'm just thinking about what would have happened if this was reality. And like if I would give wrong directions and like being a threat to like my colleague instead of helping him. So beyond like that, we explored how do participants experience the collaboration, what kind of virtual information they preferred. It's really like also looking into questions of responsibility and who's responsible for a certain outcome. And this is really something that like triggered our thinking, and we learned a lot from these experiments, including also how people actually feel when they always have the feeling that a remote expert is with them and sees everything that they are doing, including all the mistakes that just happen when people work. So that's really like a social and an ethical layer, and that for me as a social scientist, that is really like when the interesting things happen and when we are really like asked to think about our experiments, about the technology, and about its application in organizations and for people. So we also like, of course, in like with relation to the VR game, we also like try to think about or find answers in how to design a realistic training game and whether it's always needed. Then after that work, I also worked for humanitarian aid workers and talking about like immersion and how to use game elements. This is a project, it was a European research project where we try to identify technology that can help humanitarian aid workers when they are on a mission. And we used game techniques for that. So we created a board game that we played with humanitarian aid workers, where the humanitarian aid workers were able to invest in technology and then see how the investment and the technology would actually help them in their logistics work in the game. And based on their feedback, we created a technological system that they can actually use. And again, we used like game elements to create scenarios. And I think in applying this board game and role-playing techniques, you again learn a lot when you use this for requirements analysis. Because when like before the humanitarian aid workers played the game, there was one who said to us, as long as I have my mobile phone and my gun, I feel safe. I don't need your technology. And after they played the game and they experienced what type of technologies we were thinking of, it's communication, information sharing. There was also something where we thought about like automatic threat detection. Then they said, oh yeah, there may be some elements of technology that I would indeed feel more safe and better. And after that feedback and after we implemented this, we developed a large scale real life simulation. And that's also something that I would call kind of immersive applied games. So of course we weren't able to all travel to Syria, for example, or to any other crisis area, because again, that would be way too dangerous and too expensive. But we could bring the humanitarian aid experts to Delft. And what we did there was to create realistic scenarios where we were able to test the technology on. So you see like real pictures here, and all these elements of humanitarian aid work and aid logistics were something that we simulated in Delft on the campus of the university. So we created a warehouse, we created threats, we used drones, we had a roadblock that you just don't see here. And the good thing again about this was that we also had the developers of this technological system on site. So what we did was to send out the humanitarian aid workers. You see here the fake warehouse on campus and real humanitarian aid workers. This is the roadblock that they had to go through. And they tested the technology in this simulation exercise in this realistic game. And then they came back and they were able to sit down with the developers of the system and give immediate feedback. So go through a debriefing, which you see here, talk them through like how they experienced the system, what went well, what didn't. So the system, for example, had an application on a mobile phone with a so-called panic button. And there was a lot of discussion about like how to design this panic button and how it should work. And it was really, really valuable for like the developers of the system to get this immediate feedback. And you only get this if people really experience it in a realistic setting. So in that case, it was not so much, again, the technology that enabled us for deep immersion, but it was much more like the setting and the storytelling and creating realistic scenarios. And that is a field that I'm really interested in. So to help people to better prepare for disasters or to help delivering aid in the case of a disaster. I work together with two master students here. One is designing an immersive game on disaster preparation for an earthquake. And she's creating a household setting where you can just like walk through a house and you can experience an earthquake. And she wants to use it to really raise awareness. She went through the Christchurch earthquake herself and lost her house. And she really it's really like, I think, a very deep personal motivation to create this. And I talked about like all the risks included in this approach with her. But like she's deeply motivated by making people aware of this risk and making people aware of the need for a good preparation of having your emergency water and food and whatever, and these little things that you can do. And she tries to like use this immersive realistic environment to raise this awareness. Amia is another student who works together with me and the Department of Geology of UC on volcanic, on a disaster game for volcanic eruptions. And he's using real historic data of volcanic eruptions. And he's creating a tool for like communicating the science around the volcanoes and the science about like the threat detection and analysis. We first thought we could make a game for like tourists that enter the areas in New Zealand and make them aware of the risk. But we decided to better start with like students in geology so that they understand how different types of eruptions look like and how you can communicate like all the data that we have about these areas. And he's just experimenting with different ways. So you see in the big picture like a more or less realistic representation of how an eruption could look like. And then in the smaller picture, he indicates like what the effects of this eruption would be for students, just to learn about like their apparently a lot of different types of eruptions and also like hazards related to that. And he is at the moment looking into how we can use this for like a science communication tool and how to also make it really interactive. So like that it's not just a video showing the eruption, but how can we use it really as a learning tool so that students can engage with the models and manipulate it and then see the effects. And research question that he's trying to answer is how can we combine the formal models and the realistic data with game elements and not make it like funny and that people don't take it serious anymore, but that we can utilize the right game elements to like support the learning process and the development of awareness. And then of course, like we are also still looking into validated ways how to measure the learning effects or the outcomes. So there are some in some literature and some studies, but like gaming is a relatively young field compared to others. And we don't have like a lot of valid evaluation tools. So this is definitely something that we at the HIT Lab are really interested in raising the quality of like the measurements of the outcomes of applied immersive games. Based on the work of Amir and work that's already done here at the HIT Lab, also by our colleague Simon Hurman, who does a lot of work in this area, we were able to become part of one of new MB Endeavour research programs that's called Beneath the Waves, and that's led by GNS Science. where we will produce a lot of like realistic data around White Island. And then our work package is that we will again look into the design of engaging and authentic disaster games, how we call them, or like communication tools to communicate the risk around this area to a broader public. And I think this is a really exciting and interesting challenge, because like when you talk about the broader public, you talk about like such a diverse group of people, and that's usually very hard to design a game for. But we are very much looking forward to that. And there's also a PhD student. She's stuck in Pakistan at the moment, but she's looking into the use of augmented reality games for disaster risk communication. And what she does at the moment is she conducts a social media analysis to see how people during a disaster use social media and what they communicate and how they communicate. And then she's aiming at transferring this knowledge into a game design on also natural disasters. And there's like another student working with us, and like you see in all my examples how broad it is, but it's really exciting. And he is like using computer models, but then he's trying to develop an immersive role game for policymakers here in Christchurch to explore how they understand resilience, how they approach resilience, and not so much like only resilience in the sense of building a good infrastructure in a city, but also how to support communities and how to invest in social resilience. So this really community building and building up networks of people, because we see like, especially like in research on the Christchurch earthquakes, that like some parts of Christchurch, like Littleton, for example, that always had like a very strong community and that helped them really get through the disaster very well. But it's not so like obvious and not so well known in a lot of groups. Like it's very obvious to like invest in broken streets, for example, but it's not so obvious to like invest in neighborhood groups and how this can help people after disaster or to prepare for possible disasters. And that's something that Brian works on. And again, it comes like one theme at least comes back, which is like, how can we use realistic data and formal models to inform our game design and to really build like realistic but still engaging and meaningful games that like the players can use and take away something from it. And I think to summarize, questions that I'm trying to answer in my research on applied immersive games is what I just said: how to design authentic, meaningful and engaging games for experts, but also for a broader audience, how to co-design applied immersive games, including with children and vulnerable groups, and how to measure success. Yeah, I think that's a really huge research endeavor, but yeah, I'm really excited to being here, because like the Netherlands is a country with a very long tradition in applied games. A lot of organizations through to like ministries and like port authorities and stuff, they use it in their decision-making processes. It's not so accepted, or people in New Zealand are not so familiar with it. So that's really exciting. And I'm working together with the games industry to really advocate this element, not only in research, but really that like people, organizations, and society benefit from our work. And that is where I wanted to end my presentation, but I'm really happy to take your questions. Thank you.